Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Conversations with Catholics. Today, I have a very special guest, one that I am very excited for. My guest today needs no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Jimmy Akin is a senior apologist is the longest serving member of, and if I may, is the face of the world-known Catholic apologetics organization, Catholic Answers. Jimmy is also the host of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, a podcast with almost 300 episodes now, covering topics as varied as Marian Apparitions, mystical staircases, alien abductions, the Loch Ness Monster, and more. Jimmy has debated powerhouses like Dr. Bart Ehrman, Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. James White, Dr. Gavin Ortland, and many, many more. Most importantly to me, though, because I am selfish, Jimmy has given me countless lengthy and generous answers every time that I call into Catholic Answers. And Jimmy is my go-to source whenever I want to present the best version of a Catholic argument, whenever I'm trying to present that Catholic argument. With that, welcome to the show, Jimmy Akin.
Well, thank you very much. You're very kind.
Well, Jimmy, I mean it when I say thank you. So I would like to start the show with just a very big thank you. Your presence on a channel like mine means the world to me, and I know it means the world to my subscribers too. Because when I made the announcement that I'd be speaking with you, everybody was very, very excited. So thanks again.
Cool. Well, I hope I don't disappoint too much.
I have a feeling you won't, Jimmy. So our conversation today is going to cover a pretty wide range of topics. We're going to be doing everything from Marian Apparitions to maybe Eucharistic Miracles, and probably a whole lot of stuff in between as well. But where I would like to start is, how do you do it? The breadth of topics that you cover in any given open forum or Catholic Answers episode is impressive. Never mind the fact that you're simultaneously doing deep dives on varied topics on Mysterious World. And then you do debates on everything from young earth creationism to biblical history. How do you do it all?
Well, in terms of time management, it's just scheduling. But in terms of, if you're asking where I get the knowledge for these different endeavors, I guess it's a combination of things. The first factor is I'm just super curious, and I love learning stuff. And consequently, I'm an autodidact. I'm a self-teacher. So even though I do, use formal education for some purposes, I'm always teaching myself new things. And so that's part of it. Also, probably the second major factor is I've been doing this for 30 years. I mean, I've been a professional paid apologist for 30 years. I've obviously been interested in subjects for longer than that. But after 30 years of answering questions, you get a pretty good grasp of what the common questions are and how to answer them. And, I do things to constantly improve. So if I get a question, and this used to happen more in the past than it does now, but, if I would get a question and I wasn't 100% sure of the answer, I would look it up, immediately after getting off the air and do research. And over time, as people ask more questions, that builds your knowledge base. And so that's the general answer. And then when I do deeper dives on things, I study those subjects before I publicly present on them, whether it's for Mysterious World or a debate or whatever it may be.
What's the hardest, and I'll phrase it very specifically, what's the hardest kind of question that you've ever gotten, whether that's on Catholic Answers or anywhere else? And I'll say kind of question because I'm sure it's impossible to pick just one, but maybe there's a family of questions that you think are the hardest in general.
Yeah, I think there's two families that are the hardest, and they proceed along different axes. The first hardest questions are ones I just don't know the answer to, and I'm very frank about that. I publicly will mention I don't know nothing about sports ball. So it is easy to stump me on that. But even with areas that are more closely related to what I actually do professionally, there are things that are just not my area of expertise, like hagiography. the lives of the saints. I understand the theory of the saints, the doctrine of the saints very well, but I haven't spent my whole life reading saint biographies. So, if someone wants to know about the detail of some saint's life, well, that's not my area of expertise. There's also a class of questions that come in that frequently are prefaced by a question that has a relatively low chance of success. This is anything that's phrased in the form, have you ever heard of this priest or book or program or whatever? Because there are, 8 billion people out there, and they've written lots of books and done lots of programs, and the odds of me having heard of the one that you're thinking of is fairly low. Usually, though, that question is a mask for what the person's really interested in. They're not really interested in, have I ever heard of Father Joe Smith? Really, they're interested in, I heard Father Joe Smith said this, and I want to know what you think about that. And so it's often possible just by asking a follow-up question, saying, well, I'm afraid I haven't heard of him, but is there something that you're wondering about connected with him? That'll allow the real question to emerge, and then I can answer that better. The other class of questions that is difficult are what you could think of as crisis questions, where someone is in the middle of a crisis and they're concerned about something. And usually the challenge is not so much answering the question, but figuring out how to answer it in such a way that it will be beneficial to the person. It's a difference between knowing the substance of the answer and presenting it in the most useful way for the person who's in the middle of a crisis. And those are harder to do because you got to think harder. Where's this person coming from? Where are they at right now? How can I best be of service to them? What's the best way to phrase this? And even though those are harder, my boss has told me he thinks I have a special knack for doing those.
I don't think I've ever told this story on YouTube, but I was one of those crisis calls one time.
Uh-huh.
Now, I don't think it was to you, Jimmy, because who it was actually to was Bishop Robert Barron.
Oh.
Bishop Barron was on, and you'll know better than I will if he was ever on Catholic Answers for like a Q&A session. But he was on a call-in show for like a Q&A.
Actually, I wouldn't know that better than you.
Well, he was on a Catholic call-in show, and I called in. And this was a number of years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
So I must have been 20 or 21 at the time when I was kind of like in peak crisis, if I may. And truthfully, I don't remember the substance of my question or the substance of the answer, but what I do remember is how kind Bishop Barron was to me.
Mm-hmm. Good.
So I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but I think that your approach is mostly exactly what people need when they call in a time of crisis. That's something that I hope to emulate of you is your approach. You have a very ironic, if that's probably not even the right word, but the way that you handle questions is appropriate, and I'm a fan.
Well, thank you. I try to be ironic, and I try to be charitable, and I try to be as reassuring as I can. I was at a meeting at Catholic Answers once where we had some donors who were talking about their experiences, and one of them commented on my manner of answering questions and said, if my house was burning down and I talked to Jimmy Akin, it would be like, oh, okay, my house is burning down, but it's going to be okay. We'll get through this. And I do try to be as reassuring as I can for folks.
Well, I think we all appreciate it. I do have a question for you though about one of the other hardest kinds of questions that you get.
Yeah.
The questions that are, have you ever heard of X? Do you think that people are asking that with like an ulterior motive? Like they're trying to get you, like they're trying to get their soundbite. Like, oh, look, Jimmy Akin admitted that he doesn't know about this one obscure philosopher from the, 14th century who, something like that.
Well, I can't rule it out, but I don't sense that that's what's happening normally. Because I'm very frank about it. If I don't know something, I'll tell you up front. I'd much rather tell someone up front that I don't know the answer than try to fake it. And so it's not a big win given the number of things that are out there in the world. I'm not going to have heard of many things. So it's not I don't know what it proves other than, oh, there's something Jimmy didn't know about yet.
Yeah, and I try to take that same approach too. And I find that it seems like it takes the wind out of the sails for some people who are hoping to get you to try to muddle your way through a question. But then when you're just frank, you say, well, I actually don't know that, but I'll look into it. I feel like people, sometimes that's not what they're looking for, because they're looking for some kind of big reaction. So I've got a question for you. Everything that we've been talking about right now was kind of related to Catholic answers, but I've got a Mysterious World question for you.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite episode of Mysterious World, or if not favorite, maybe one that you're most proud of? And I'll share that my favorite is episode 60, the La Salette one, and I'll tell you why after. But
okay,
I'm interested to hear yours.
Well, I don't really think in terms of favorites. That would mean, looking back over my oeuvre and ranking it, and I don't really do that. What I do instead is I look back over things I've done, especially recent things I've done, and say, how did I do there? Could I have done it better? How could I have done it better? But I don't have particular favorites. I usually answer this question by saying frequently my favorite episode is the one I was just working on, because I recently got my juices up about that subject when I was researching and writing about it. However, in terms of are there episodes that I'm particularly proud of? I think, yeah, and probably one of the ones I'm most proud of is episode 188, which is on Is It Always Demons? Because there are a lot of people in the Christian world who want to just dismiss anything that's mysterious as, oh, it must be demons. And that can be a really destructive hypothesis. And I opened the episode with two I think very compelling illustrations of why people should not leap to the demon hypothesis as an explanation. The first one, I actually used some video, but then YouTube wouldn't let me. But I ended up using some audio from the church lady sketch from Saturday Night Live. Could it be Satan? Because the joke of that sketch, or part of the joke of that sketch, is the church lady, Enid Strict, great trait name, makes Christians look ridiculous. Now, she's not always completely wrong. In fact, they point that out in some sketches. She's not just completely wrong on everything, but she does make Christians look ridiculous by automatically leaping to, this is Satan doing this. And so I wanted to include that as a way of making the point to the audience of we don't want to be like Enid Strict. We don't want to make our faith look ridiculous. The other illustration that I began the show with was a list of like 7 articles, all from the last 2 years in the news, of botched home exorcisms where a child died. And that was another, I think, compelling way of making the point, do not automatically leap to the demon hypothesis. People have died because of this. And then I backed off from those vivid illustrations, and we talked more about the theory, and I pointed out how if people in the past, if our ancestors had automatically leaped to the demon hypothesis for everything they didn't understand, well, guess what we wouldn't have? We wouldn't have modern science. We wouldn't have modern medicine. We wouldn't have all kinds of things that we take. We wouldn't have technology. We wouldn't have all kinds of things if you just automatically leap to that hypothesis and you get scared off from something. So I think because of how common that tendency is, I thought it was important to sound that as a warning. And I think I was able to do so effectively. So I am proud of that episode in particular.
I want to highlight this comment. And just to tell you about my audience a little bit, Jimmy, my audience is kind of funny in the sense that I do have people like me who are, ex-Catholic, for lack of a better term. But I also have a lot of Catholics. And Anton is my friend. He is Catholic. And he says, applause for Jimmy for cautioning against people jumping on board the It's Demons train.
Thank you.
And yeah, I want to echo that. I do think that demonology is one of those things where, and I'll just speak from, the trad. I'll be the trad of the, of
For
the
purposes of
conversation.
discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
In trad culture, it's always demons has a little bit of truth to it.
Yeah.
And that is dangerous. And the dangers of it are just never spoken about ever in trad circles. In fact, I think talking about that would almost be looked down on as like but isn't it like way more dangerous to do too little than to do too much when it comes to demonology? I think that would be the response.
Well, then that's what ends you up with dead kids. If it's that kind of argumentation of, well, isn't it better to overreact than underreact? Well, actually, no. Both overreaction and underreaction are bad. One of the things that I have as a current project, and I've been doing this for a while, but I've been studying the tradition carefully on mysterious subjects and what thinkers in prior centuries have said, including big names like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, both of whom are not only saints and theologians and world famous, they're also doctors of the church, meaning they're cream of the crop. And what I find frequently is people who identify as traditionalists, and this is not everybody, but a lot of people who identify as traditionalists really don't have a deep knowledge of the tradition. They have a knowledge of certain aspects of the tradition that have been passed down to them in recent times, but they don't really have a thorough knowledge of its history. So, for example, lots of people, and this is not just traditionalist Catholics, this is something you'll hear, for example, in Protestant communities as well. They'd say anything like, oh, psychic powers, got to stay away from those. That's all demons, or you're opening yourself to demons. Can't have anything to do with psychic powers. Well, okay, maybe, but that's not the traditional position in Catholic circles. Both St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas believed in what we today would call psychic powers. For example, they both believed in what we would call precognition, the ability to, without a supernatural prophecy from God, just based on human nature, to be able to perceive things about the future. St. Thomas Aquinas called this natural prophecy to distinguish it from the supernatural prophecy that God gives. Also, the Catholic Church is not opposed to dowsing. That's where you see people using, sticks or a forked rod or something to try to find water or oil or missing object. Actually, there have been multiple bishops and priests who have been dowsers. Popes have given their apostolic blessing to societies of dowsers. And under the most recent ruling, there are no regulations about what laity can do with regard to dowsing, and priests are explicitly given permission to douse for purposes of scientific research. Even priests explicitly from the Holy Office, now the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, priests can douse for purposes of doing scientific research. Okay, this is not the closed, it's always demons, got to stay away from that whole psychic thing. But these are parts of the tradition that a lot of people just don't know. They're aware of the certain aspects of the tradition that have been communicated to them in recent times, but they don't have a broader, deeper knowledge of the history of the tradition.
I don't want to speak too poorly, at least not on this episode of the kind of culture that I grew up in, but I can confirm that there are it's very funny. The trad community will complain without ceasing about the lack of catechesis among Novus Ordo Catholics without noticing the lack of catechesis among traditionalist Catholics.
Yeah.
Which, and certainly let me do the, hashtag not all trads, So,
yeah, exactly. It's not everybody.
Right. The whole point about dowsing. So that's something that I didn't even know until right now, although apparently I should know it because, some of the folks in the audience remember you talked about this on a recent episode that was very good. And I'm not alone in not knowing this. My friend, Colin, also grew up in the FSSP with me.
Uh-huh.
And so Colin didn't know it either. So I'm not crazy for not knowing it. Dowsing, would that be like dowsing with a legitimate Catholic purpose, or is it like dowsing like to find a lost item or something?
Well, I'm not sure what you would mean by a legitimate Catholic purpose. I mean, people traditionally pray to St. Anthony to find lost objects, and that seems to be an acceptable Catholic purpose. So
that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I distinctly remember praying to St. Anthony until I found whatever I lost when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Dear St. Anthony, please come around. Something is lost and can't be found. I would say that over and over and over and over. I can't believe I remember that, actually.
I've never been a fan of that particular formulation of the prayer. It sounds, or the one I've heard is, Tony, turn around, something's lost that must be found. And that's always sounded a little irreverent to me, a little, but that's just a personal preference. On the other hand, what we have here, if you pray that prayer until you find the object, then we have what in science is known as the stopping problem. Because if you determine if you don't have a predetermined stopping point for your experiment, then you can't rely on the results, because you could always continue the experiment until you get the result you want. But then people aren't praying to St. Anthony typically as part of a scientific experiment. So
we could set one up.
We could.
Actually, I've got a question for you. Would you expect, and this is off the cuff, but would you expect, if there were a scientific, like a robust scientific experiment, would you expect people who prayed to St. Anthony to actually find their lost car keys more than people who didn't? Like, do you think that St. Anthony, his intercession, could legitimately impact the world in this very materialistic way?
Well, I think that actually probably they would find them more, but the question would be, is it St. Anthony, or are they using their natural dowsing ability to find the keys? Because they're trying to find the keys, they're open to some kind of anomalous method of finding the keys, and that they could be using their own psychic abilities to locate them. There is a parallel to this in parapsychology, which I've been studying closely for several years now. I've been taking classes in it, and I even teach it now. There have been studies not of finding keys, but there have been studies of prayer. And indeed, when you have people praying for a given test population in comparison to a control population, the test population in many studies that are statistically significant does better. Really? In terms of healing. And this has been tried not only with humans, but with other organisms too, like mice and plants and things like that. Now, there's a question, though. There are some methodological issues here that make part of it harder to tease out. For example, one of the things is a lot of people who are willing to pray have a problem with, I can't just pray for one group of people. If I'm praying for, I have to be fair. I have to love everybody. And so you don't know how much of their intention or other people's intentions is affecting the control group. Nevertheless, there is a statistical difference. But there have also been experiments with people from different religions praying, and the people, it doesn't seem to matter what religion the person is. If they're praying, the prayer tends to have a positive effect. Now, that could be explained in a number of different ways. One of them is God loves everybody, and if people are turning to him, even if they don't understand him in exactly the Christian way, he'll want to help them. And so he'll help them regardless of whether their theology is 100% correct. So there are some issues here. It's also possible that what's happening is in some measure or in a full measure, it could be due to psychic functioning as well. They may be, if they're wanting to heal somebody, if they're wanting someone to be healed, their own abilities may produce that. And incidentally, on that subject, an argument recently occurred to me. The ancients didn't distinguish between the natural and the supernatural the way we do. Those categories weren't really in place in that way. So, if we think about how St. Paul treats spiritual gifts, like in 1 Corinthians, one of the gifts he mentions is teaching, another is healing. Well, okay, so if I have a spiritual gift, I'm pretty sure that it's teaching. But I wouldn't say that I would have zero ability as a teacher before I became a Christian. And so to me, it looks like, well, I have a native teaching ability that's natural, and then the Holy Spirit has elevated that and used it for his purposes. And that's the spiritual component, but there's a natural foundation to it. So as Aquinas says, grace perfects nature. There's some natural teaching ability on my part, which the Holy Spirit then uses and perfects. Well, if that's true of the gift of teaching, can't the same thing be true of the gift of healing? Might some people not have a natural and therefore psychic ability to heal, which then, in cases of Christians, the Holy Spirit can perfect and elevate and use for his purposes? And so if I can't dismiss that there's a natural component to teaching in a spiritual context, I can't dismiss that there might be a natural component to healing in a spiritual context as well.
Yeah, so I'm right there with you in terms of something that I'll say frequently, somewhat frequently, is that the natural supernatural distinction is just entirely unhelpful. It's just
I don't think it's unhelpful, but it's not the absolute we tend to think of it as.
Okay, yeah. And maybe I'll tease out what I mean for you to see if you have thoughts there. When I say that it's unhelpful, what I mean is something like we can only interact with things that have causal power, right? And if it has causal, like if it causes something to occur, then we can measure it, and we call it natural at that point. So if something is entirely supernatural, as in like it just there's no causation at all in our universe, then it's not really something that we can like interact with. And so that's why I think it's kind of unhelpful to talk about supernatural things, because there could almost be any number of like abstract objects, right? Like we have no idea how many there possibly could be if all of them are just not interacting with us in any detectable way. That's kind of what I think about supernatural, and that's why I call it unhelpful. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a definitional issue. I think it depends on how you define nature and supernature. And I recognize different ways of approaching that. Now, you just did it in terms of causality, and the analytic philosopher in me would have a question about, does that need to be reframed a little bit? Because you said if we only interact with causal things. I can certainly grant that as in terms of what we generally do, but I could imagine things. It's going to depend on what you mean by causal. I can imagine entities that we can affect that have no ability to affect anything else we can measure. And so we actually would be interacting with those entities if we have an effect on them, even if we're not capable of perceiving that in some way. But at that point, Occam's razor would kick in for me, and I'd say, yeah, but if you can't see the effect that you're having on them, then you may as well not investigate these because you have no way of verifying them. But to back up to the larger question about nature and supernature, I think there are a couple of different useful ways of thinking about this issue. One way is defining nature in terms of the physical universe that we see around us, made out of matter and energy that we already have a good understanding of. Well, it could turn out that that there are things that are real that are not made out of matter and energy that we currently understand. And if they're different enough, if we can see there's like two different sets of rules operating, one of which connects with physical entities made out of matter and one of which does not, then I think we could say, okay, well then whatever is not physical but is causally real, we can call that supernatural. You can expand the term natural to just mean anything that's real, and that's fine. But at least the way the terms have historically been used, where people do talk about the supernatural in contrast to the natural, it seems to me that when they speak of the supernatural, they're thinking of something that is real and has causal effects, but is nevertheless not physical, as we understand what physical matter and energy are. The other way, and this is, I think this is useful in a different context, in terms of thinking about what's natural and what's supernatural, is in terms of human nature specifically. So if human nature is capable of producing an effect, I would say that's a natural effect. But if human nature does not produce the effect, if it's something that has a nature superior to ours, like angels or God, then I would say, well, that's supernature because it's above human nature. So I think that there are senses in which the terms natural and supernatural can be used that are meaningful and helpful. But I agree with you that I think it's a matter of definition. It's how you're using the terms in a given context.
Yeah, and I do imagine that a lot of people kind of use the terms a little bit willy-nilly. Like sometimes it might mean what I say, and sometimes they might mean one of the two options that you said, kind of. And that might be part of the explanation for why I think of it as kind of unhelpful. I've got a question for you, if you don't mind, about I guess about both of those definitions. So the first definition was just kind of like, hey, look, if it doesn't fall into like that matter energy category, which pretty much everything falls into, then we're going to refer to it as supernatural. When you were explaining that, I found myself quite sympathetic to that idea. I was like, yeah, okay, cool. And I was started to think about things like, does anything that we kind of know of and that we do interact with, does anything kind of fall into that category? The one thing that I thought about was photons, kind of, because are they matter? Well, no, they're massless. Is it energy? Well, no, it's a particle, so it's not exactly energy. But it's kind of like in between a little bit. But I don't think that most people would call light a supernatural thing. So I guess, and let me just pause here before I ask the question about the second one. But the second option, let me just sketch it real quick.
Yeah.
The second one was, oh no, I'm losing it. The second definition of supernatural was
real causal, but not physical.
That's right. Yeah. Tell you what. Let me pause right here and just say, with regard to the first one, kind of like light, can you think of anything else that like humans tend to interact, or at least humans say that they interact with on like a daily basis, that would fall under that category, just to help me kind of understand it better?
Okay. Well, actually, I would so photons are force-carrying particles, and thus they're involved in energetic interactions. And so I would classify photons as physical.
Okay.
They may not be touchable, you can't feel them with your fingers, but that's because they're too small individually. You make a coherent beam of light out of them, you can totally burn your hand off. That's what a laser is. You get a sufficiently strong laser and your hand is toast. So I would say those are physical. In terms of things that people interact with, on a daily basis that could be classified as non-physical, it's going to depend on the culture that you're in. There's actually substantial evidence that all of us, believe it or not, and I can point you to the studies, there's actually substantial evidence that all of us have low-level ESP that we use constantly without realizing it. In fact, there's an evolutionary advantage to having it. In some cultures, what we would consider ESP experiences would be considered totally normal. Whereas in our culture, they're considered abnormal. But in a lot of cultures, no, it's totally normal. Of course, you can remotely view distant objects. Everybody knows that. Or, of course, you can get information about the future. So I think psi phenomena, which includes ESP and psychokinesis, actually we have good evidence that it exists and that we all use it a lot without even realizing it. But it utterly fails to conform to what we know about matter and energy. So it looks like something that is not physical, but that really does exist, that we have empirical evidence it exists.
Yeah, I'm super interested to see these studies. So maybe after the call is over, I'll shoot you an email and just say like, hey, tomorrow, next week, whatever. Maybe you can shoot me those the links to those studies. So yeah, I'm it's probably wouldn't be shocking to you if I shared with you that I'm skeptical about all the ESP stuff.
Yeah, I figured.
Yeah, I didn't think
I
that
was, I
huge.
was, I was too. I was very skeptical of ESP, but then I started actually reading the scientific literature on the subject, and it's like, wow, there is much, much, much better evidence for this than I had supposed. In physics, the standard for a discovery is the 5 sigma level. That's 5 standard deviations away from the mean.
I have a
Well,
Lean Six Sigma yellow belt.
oh, cool. Well, it turns out that there are parapsychological studies of ESP that have results way beyond 5 and even 6 sigma.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to be super keen to dig into these studies.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that just occurred to me while we were just kind of like thinking about it is, like this would almost seem to imply, so like remote viewing, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
uh, we would need to be able to like form images in our mind at least without like the necessary, like the photons that we would otherwise need, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't be hitting our eye, but we'd be
Mm-hmm.
forming that image anyway.
Yep.
Do these articles have like any kind of proposed explanation for like how it is, just like from a
How it works.
yeah.
Yeah, there are preliminary proposals for that, but none of them has been able to be verified to the level that it's universally accepted. We're kind of in the same stage with in terms of understanding psychic phenomena. If I say psi, it means the same thing as psychic. We're at the same stage of understanding that we were with gravity prior to recent decades. When Isaac Newton proposed his theory of gravity, he had no idea how it works. All he knew is that falling objects and orbiting planets obey certain equations. You can have these equations that predict what the planet's going to do or what the object is going to do. He had no idea how the effect was accomplished. In fact, it was contrary to the science of his day, which was Aristotelian. In Aristotelian science, there is no such thing as action at a distance. In order for one object to have an effect on another object, that effect has to be transmitted through a physical medium. The same way you can't hear my voice if there's no air in between us to carry the sound waves. Well, they thought the same thing was true of everything. And so there was no explanation for how gravity could affect one planet from another. What's this magical effect at a distance that two massive objects have on each other? And in fact, Isaac Newton was accused of introducing principles of natural magic into science because there was just there was no supporting theory for these effects. But nevertheless, the equations worked and people got used to the idea of gravity, even though they had no idea how to explain it. Eventually, in the early 20th century, Albert Einstein proposed that gravity is a distortion of space-time. So massive objects warp space-time, and that affects the motion of other objects around them. And that's his proposal, but even that's not certain. We really today still don't have a good grasp of how gravity works. We can describe its behavior, in terms of the equations we've got, but we don't know what's really doing it. And we're kind of in the same position when it comes to psi phenomena. We've got good observational data that there is a real effect here. It's not always super strong, but there is a real effect here that holds up statistically, and we have guesses about what might explain it, but we don't have enough data yet to be able to formulate a fundamental theory of it.
So, and this might be a tough question without having the papers like immediately in front of you, but I'm curious, what do we have enough data for? And the kind of answer that I'm looking for is something like this. So we do have enough data for the humans are able to accurately predict things that will occur 20 minutes in the future, or we have humans are actually able to accurately tell you what the color of the triangle that's in the other room is in or whatever. Do we have good evidence of concrete things like that, even if we don't have the explanation yet, or are we not even that far yet?
Oh no, we have that. We can. There is an effect in which humans anomalously acquire information, meaning without using the physical senses, without, in the case of precognition, without using rational prediction methodology, like predicting the weather. We have anomalous information acquisition on the part of humans about targets that are either distant or in another location or in somebody's mind, that's telepathy, that are above random chance. Now, it's not always massively above random chance, but it is consistently above random chance. So there's some kind of anomalous information acquisition that happens reliably enough that it's measurable.
That's kind of blowing my mind a little bit. And so I think I should probably hesitate from asking too many more questions, because if I don't, I'll just be pestering you with questions about these studies all night, and I should probably just go read the studies. And this is a total aside, but Catholic Answers is in the live chat, and so I don't know who runs the.
That's probably Thomas. Howdy, Thomas.
Hi, Thomas. I was gonna make a joke and say I'm just gonna choose to believe that it's Sai, and I was just gonna say hi, Sai. So that's cool. Thanks for being here. Official Catholic Answers, Thomas. But and look, we also have the Relay Theology team in here.
Oh, so hey. Good to see y'all.
And it's Zach.
Oh, Zach. Okay. Good to see you, Zach.
Okay. So if you don't mind, Jimmy, I might change gears a little bit, but it is related. So we've been talking a lot about kind of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and then kind of the melding of the two. And what I mean by the melding of the two is, I mean, ESP and dowsing and these various topics we've been covering. Perhaps another area where the supernatural and the natural might meld a little bit is Marian Apparitions. I've been on like a little bit of a kick, I guess, on my channel, doing, I guess, deep dives into Marian Apparitions.
Oh, by the way, that reminds me. You said that you really liked the episode where I dealt with La Salette, and you were going to mention why.
Yes, and this is a perfect time for me to explain that. So I grew up in the FSSP, which, for those of you in the audience who might not know, it's a traditionalist organization in line with Rome.
It stands for the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter.
Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, sometimes I talk in acronyms, but generally speaking, begrudgingly in line with Rome is what I'll say. And La Salette was a big deal for us. And we talked all the time about the rotten popes and the coming Antichrist. And I legitimately had no idea that those prophecies expired in the year 2000 until I watched your episode. And I don't think I had ever seen any Catholic, public Catholic apologist ever look at any Marian apparition that had ever received any kind of endorsement from the Catholic Church, and then come out and then kind of just publicly say, yeah, guys, I think this one, I think we should be skeptical of it. I've only ever seen the kind of the apologetic move of just like do what you want. Nobody has to believe this. Although I do contest that, and that might be a conversation for another day. At least trads don't act like Fatima is optional. Regardless, that's something different.
Devotees of particular apparitions tend not to act that way.
Yeah. But you highlighted in the La Salette episode, which is Mysterious World episode 60, the exact kind of skeptical attitude that I think is super important for everybody to have, because the same attitude that you expressed with regards to demonology, that attitude that saved the lives of children, that same attitude, I think, should make us skeptical of La Salette. I had never heard anybody else talk about that, much less put the information out there in a very like you did. And so for that reason, that episode is my favorite episode of Mysterious World.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I try to be as objective and honest as I can. The church, so for people who may not be familiar, La Salette is a place in France. And in the 19th century, there were two children there who reported seeing the Virgin Mary there, and she gave them certain secrets that involved predictions. Now, the church looked at the apparition at the time and arrived at a conclusion that it looked like it was genuine. Now, when the church arrives at a judgment like that, it is not a matter of doctrine. It is not something Catholics are required to believe. Basically, and this is not the exact words of Joseph Ratzinger, but they're pretty close. When the church approves an apparition, what it does is essentially it finds that there's nothing wrong, like doctrinally, with this, and there's some evidence that makes it reasonable to believe it. Not that it's certain, it's just reasonable. And so in the 19th century, the church looked at the La Salette apparition and said, okay, is there anything heretical here? No. Is there some good evidence that makes it reasonable to believe that this could be genuine? And they said, yeah. But the predictions that the Virgin Mary had supposedly made to these children had not yet had time to be fulfilled one way or the other. So you couldn't really count those as evidence for or against this apparition. But the predictions that they were given are datable. And we're so far past the window of when they could have been fulfilled that now, in hindsight, it's obvious those predictions appear false. And so we have more evidence now than the church authorities did when they were initially looking at the investigation. And I would say, looking at the apparition, and I would say that in light of what we know now, there are very serious questions about La Salette being an authentic apparition. I think the balance of evidence would be against that.
Yeah. And if you're not convinced right now, after Jimmy's brief explanation, go see Jimmy's longer explanation in the form of episode 60 of Mysterious World. But I've got kind of the opposite question for you about Marian apparitions. Of all the various Marian apparitions, so perhaps La Salette is the least likely to be true of all of them, although maybe you have a different one in mind. But my question for you is...
there are ones I think are flat out false, but not the famous ones.
Okay. I have so many questions. Let me start with the first one. Which apparition do you think is the most likely to be authentic?
Well, I think that there are apparitions that I simply have not studied yet that are probably very highly likely to be genuinely supernatural. But this is just like hagiography is not my wheelhouse. Neither is every Marian apparition in the history of the world. So what I do is I understand the theory of Marian apparitions, and I can talk about that. But then before commenting on particular apparitions, I have to study them carefully in order to form a personal opinion about them. And otherwise, I tend to defer to the church's judgment, until I have studied it for myself. But of the ones that I have studied, so that's a fairly small set. And these are the ones that most of them have been episodes of Mysterious World, because that tends to be what motivates me to do the study. Is I want to do an episode on this, so now it's time to study it. So of the ones that I've actually studied carefully, I would say I think Fatima is the one that's most likely that has the best evidence for it being genuine. So that's the basic answer. Of the ones I've studied, I would say I think Fatima has the best supporting evidence.
Yeah, let me share some thoughts and see what you think. So I'm of two minds about which one I think is the most likely to be authentic. Fatima is definitely up there for me, and Fatima has this thing about it that I think is both an advantage and a disadvantage. And so I'm not sure if the advantage outweighs the disadvantage, and then another one like Akita, for instance, might edge out Fatima for me personally, and here's why.
Okay.
We do have dozens of testimonies from people who say that they saw the sun dance, but we likewise have dozens of testimonies of people who say that they didn't see anything at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I view that as like a kind of a double-edged sword in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have prophecies that I argue are just kind of a lot. So either less impressive once you learn more about them, and also like I'm very skeptical about the assassination attempt on Pope St. John Paul II being fulfilling the third prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have apparitions like, for instance, Akita, where the nature of the miracle is just a lot less public. Like instead of being a crowd of like at least 30,000 people, we're talking about a cloister of nuns seeing a weeping statue. So Akita has like a humility to it that the bigger and grander apparitions don't have. And so I'm not sure if that humility and that like its smaller scope makes it better or worse. You know what I mean? I'm not sure. So that's why I'm torn.
Okay. So you asked what I think about all that. For me, let's start with Akita. Both of these apparitions have been approved by the church, meaning there's nothing heretical in them, and there's some good reason to make it reasonable to accept them. And that may be true of both of them, but for me, the problem with Akita is that, so this involved a weeping statue in addition to visions. The weeping statue, when it was tested on different occasions, the tears had different blood types. And that's, from a skeptical perspective, that suggests it had like 3 different blood types. That suggests 3 different people were hoaxing that. Now, that doesn't disprove the visions. Even if there was a counter argument regarding the blood types of like, oh, it shows Mary's universal love for people of all blood types. I don't find that particularly persuasive. That sounds to me like it's attempting to explain away evidence that points in the other direction. If you have a statue with 3 different blood types, that's the most common explanation of that would be hoax. Now, that doesn't mean that the visions were also hoaxed. Sister Sasagawa, who was the visionary, she may have had legitimate visions, and other people in the convent may have been responsible for what happened with the statue. Obviously, it couldn't have been Sister Sasagawa because she only has 1 blood type herself. So on the hoax hypothesis, it couldn't be limited to her, and thus it may not have involved her. But I find the 3 blood types of the statue a mark against authenticity in this case, at least of the experience as a whole. When it comes to Fatima, I haven't studied the case reports regarding the miracle of the sun in detail. It wouldn't surprise me if some people saw the phenomena and others didn't. That wouldn't mean it's inauthentic. What that would mean is it wasn't a physical phenomenon. But it didn't mean that a lot of people didn't have a vision, and maybe other people who were more closed to the visionary experience didn't see anything. We see things like that in paranormal field reports, where you'll have some people will perceive an apparition of a ghost and other people will not. And that what that shows you, it doesn't tell you anything about is a ghost there or not. It tells you if there is one here, it's not a physical thing. But for me, the convincing evidence, I think the most convincing evidence for Fatima is not the miracle of the sun, but I think it's the assassination attempt. And John Paul, the vision involved an assassination attempt on a pope in connection with communism, and then on the anniversary of this major date in Fatima history, there is an assassination attempt on John Paul II, plausibly in connection with communism. And I understand your views where you're saying, well, not everything corresponds exactly, and I agree. I think to me that's not a problem, because I think the symbolism in this vision works similarly to how symbolism works in biblical prophecy. It's not meant to be a videotape of what's going to happen. You read the book of Revelation. It's not meant to be a videotape like there's going to literally be a red dragon in the sky with 7 heads. And when you read the third secret of Fatima in light of the way biblical prophecy works, I think it's a very strong match. But I understand you have a different opinion on that.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of share that for me, and this says a lot more about me than it does about anything else, but I am moved a lot more, I think, by those more kind of standard empirical kind of claims like the miracle of the sun. So it's funny that you and I both put Fatima at either the top or at least very close to the top in my case, although for different reasons. And I just kind of think that's funny. But I do think that speaks to the volume of data for Fatima. Like there just isn't as much data for a lot of other apparitions.
Right.
And so that leads me to a question about apparitions. And this is kind of off the top of my head, but there are certain apparitions that I am super skeptical of, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts here. I'm thinking in particular of any apparition that is older than, like, let's say 700 years old or something like that. In particular, right now, what's occurring to me is Our Lady of the Pillar, which is it's a story about Our Lady appearing in Spain while she would have been alive in Israel. And so that's like an apparition, but it's also kind of not really an apparition as much as it is bilocation, because Our Lady would have still been alive. And the reason I'm so skeptical of that one is because there appears to be no mention of it for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, like, do you share my skepticism of what I'll refer to as like old apparitions? And when I say old, I mean like 700 years plus.
Well, I up to a point, Lord Copper. Let's take this Our Lady of the Pillar as an example. So I don't have any problem with bilocation. I think it's a well-established paranormal phenomenon. I know people it's happened to, where, while they're still alive, they have an out-of-body experience and they are perceived on the other end by people who are there. So I don't have a problem with bilocation. I also have a Mysterious World episode on it if you want to know more about that. Although I don't tell the stories of the people I know it's happened to. I just haven't had the occasion to. But my problem here is lack of good evidence for it. If something like this happened in AD 42 or whenever, and it's not mentioned in the sources for 1,000 years, okay, that's not good evidence. So now, if we had evidence within, say, 50 years reporting this, I'd take it much more seriously. Even that, I wouldn't be convinced by a report like that, but it would have vastly more weight than a first report being 1,000 years later. That's just way too long for an oral tradition of something like that to be preserved without any mention showing up in the literary record. And it's for that reason that I haven't covered a lot of Marian apparitions prior to the 1800s. Because there's like Our Lady of Good Hope or whatever, back in the 1500s. And okay, I just don't have good documentation in English that I can consult on that. So I'm not in a position to form an opinion about it. I'm quite open. I'm sure Mary's been appearing to people in every age. But in order to support a particular apparition, I need good documentation to be able to investigate it, and I don't have it for ones prior to the 1800s.
I mean, the fact of the matter.
So I just have to be agnostic on a lot of those.
Yeah, and I mean, most humans, if you just look at a broad, over time, most humans couldn't really read or write. So you can. It's not too hard to imagine Mary appearing to some illiterate person. 1,000 years ago. And so, he goes and he tells this priest, "Hey, Mary appeared to me." And the priest is like, "Yeah, okay, get lost." And, and that's kind of it. And then nobody would know about it because.
I'm sure hopefully priests are more polite about it than get lost, but I'm sure the majority of Marian apparitions that are genuine have never been reported in the literature because they're private. A lot of people may not feel the obligation or need to tell anyone about it. And of those who do, it likely remains just on the local parish level and doesn't get broader popularity than that.
Yeah. And something that I heard that stuck with me was, I think it was a joke, but the person who said it said something to the effect of like, the most likely Marian apparitions are the one where she appears but says nothing, or at least very little. And I kind of got a kick out of that.
Well, it may be true. It's certainly harder to falsify, but it's also harder to verify if you don't have veridical information that can be checked out later.
Very true. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing that we haven't quite gotten through the even what I just had in the title of this video. So if it's all right with you, are you okay with discussing Eucharistic miracles for at least a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I also wanted to make sure we got to your question about nominalism.
Oh, yes. When you're talking about nominalism, are you just referring to what I was talking about earlier with how abstract objects don't really interact with?
Well, you had a specific question you were going to ask me concerning rejecting Catholicism on philosophical grounds, and you cited nominalism in connection with that, and I wanted to make sure we covered that.
Yes. I think now is a great time for that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. In as few words as I can. When I was first kind of just questioning things, I think the very first thing for me was probably I realized that like my moral intuitions didn't line up with what the church said morality was. So I looked into it, learned about teleology. I realized that like my moral intuitions didn't line up with like a teleological understanding of morality. So I thought, that's a little weird. Then I started looking into other philosophical concepts such as abstracta. And I realized, and this was, I blame a lot of this on the fact that I was in engineering school at the time. But I realized that like if something truly is causally inert, then I just simply have no way of actually verifying that it exists. And so a simple application of Occam's razor just says, yeah, no, the abstract objects, they don't exist. Or at least I have no reason to think that they do. And that probably sounds all well and good to most Catholics. Probably hear that and they go, okay, Kevin, what's the big deal? Well, I guess the big deal for me is transubstantiation is one of them. So in a word, transubstantiation, I don't know what that means if substances don't exist, right? Like that gets a little hairy, I suppose. Although some of the Catholics, even in the sidebar listening right now, have been talking to me about some real presence without transubstantiation kind of stuff, which I think is interesting. But I see other problems for the Catholic nominalists as well, such as like natures wouldn't really exist. And so like, Jesus having human nature and divine nature would probably be tough if natures didn't exist too. So that's kind of like very briefly, like the problems that I see with the Catholic who wants to accept nominalism. Like it seems like that's kind of tough to do.
Okay. So I don't see why a Catholic can't accept nominalism. I understand that nominalism has been kind of dissed by a lot of people in the Thomistic tradition, but so what? The church does not commit to any one particular philosophical school of thought, and it has not condemned nominalism. In fact, there have been prominent Catholic thinkers who have been classified as nominalists, like John Buridan and William of Ockham, and they were Catholics and they believed in transubstantiation. And you can take a position I've seen some Thomists take and say, well, yeah, but it will lead to this. Well, no, it doesn't have to lead. Nothing has to lead beyond its own implications. And nominalism does not imply that transubstantiation is false. We may use the term substance, in transubstantiation, but that doesn't mean that universals or abstract objects, which are not the same thing, but they're both what nominalism rejects, either universals or abstract objects or both. I don't see how transubstantiation involves those, because what transubstantiation means is this thing that used to be bread is not bread anymore. It is now Jesus. It still looks like bread, but it's not actually bread. It's now Jesus. And you don't have to invoke universals or abstract objects for that. So I just don't see how nominalism precludes transubstantiation at all. Similarly, I don't see how it precludes the incarnation, because on a nominalist account, I'm a human being, and if you want to say it, I have a human nature, you can say that. It doesn't mean that my nature is anything other than the collection of properties I have, which allows me to fit within the class of human. And so if in the doctrine of the incarnation, well, Jesus had a divine nature, and that would be, the set of things that make one God. And then in time, he acquired a human nature, which on a nominalist account would be the set of things that are needed to qualify as a human. And so I just don't see how nominalism precludes these concepts. So I that would be my thought on that.
Yeah. And your point about transubstantiation too, is something that I've been kind of like mulling over a lot, because some of my Catholic friends have made very similar points to the point that you just made. And the way that they're phrasing it is they'll say like, sure, transubstantiation, strictly speaking, is false. Sure. But that's not what matters. The real presence is what matters. And the real presence is true whether or not nominalism is also true.
Yeah. So what the church has actually defined is not what the church has defined is there is a miraculous change in the elements of the Eucharist such that they become Jesus, and that this transformation has been fittingly called transubstantiation. So what the church's actual teaching is that we can fittingly call this transubstantiation. It doesn't mean that transubstantiation is the exclusive way of understanding this. It means this is a useful or fitting way of articulating this to help communicate to people the reality of the change that's been made. So if you want to use different vocabulary, you can. Where you come into conflict with Catholic doctrine is if you said, "Oh, but that's just a totally unsuitable phrase." It doesn't remotely convey anything about what's really happening here.
I'm only pulling this comment up because Daniel in the comments is one of the Catholics who turned me on to the whole real presence without nominalism, real presence with nominalism kind of thing. So I think his thank you is that Jimmy Akin has endorsed what he's been saying the whole time. So I think that is what he's excited about.
Cool.
And then I'll also pull up. So this is Dave Paulman. You may be familiar with Dave Paulman. He runs the channel Faith Because of Reason, and he non-Catholic Christian. But he says that he agrees with Jimmy. He considers himself a nominalist of sorts, and he affirms that natures exist. This is something that I do find myself like moving on recently. So like I'm considerably less certain today that nominalism is a good reason. Or I should say this, I'm considerably less certain today that nominalism is something that a Catholic cannot hold in good conscience compared to me 6 months ago or whatever.
Okay. Well, I would point out the church has never condemned it, and nominalism has been around in Christian circles since, the 14th century. So the church has had, 600-700 years to condemn it if it was going to, and it hasn't. So I would say I don't see any reason you can't be. Personally, I don't have, just so you know where I'm coming from, I don't have a firm stand when it comes to nominalism or realism. I'm sure I wouldn't be a Platonic realist and think there's this realm of ideas that are the true things and we're just imperfect copies of them. I don't buy that at all. I could go either way with moderate realism or nominalism. And I actually think that given the varieties of both of them, that they may actually be consistent with each other. But even if they're not, I tend to have nominalist sympathies. I have sympathy with nominalism for a whole bunch of reasons we won't have time to go into. I'm not a convinced nominalist, but I'm sympathetic. And I'm also sympathetic to moderate realism.
Jimmy Akin of Occam. Okay, cool. I think that was pretty much the whole point that I had on nominalism.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to tie a bow on the nominalist thing?
No, I think that's all. That's the substance of what I had to say.
Okay.
I was curious to see where you perceived the conflict between it and Catholicism, and hope to address that.
Yeah. This is definitely something that I find myself moving on. And you haven't heard me say I am utterly convinced that I was wrong, but you can probably hear in my voice that I'm moving in that direction, right?
Then my job here is done.
And you know what's interesting too is that so I was speaking with Gideon Lazar, who I know that you know because you.
Oh yeah, we've debated.
Yeah, I had him on my channel 2 weeks ago, I guess at this point. Not for like a debate, just for a conversation like the one that we're having right now. And he made some similar points to what you just made, but we weren't just talking about nominalism. We were also talking about mereological nihilism. And his point was something like, Kevin, you've got the two mixed up. Like, nominalism is not a problem for the Catholic, but mereological nihilism might be. So, I guess that's something to think about, I guess. And I didn't really think that mereological nihilism was like a huge problem for the Catholics, to be honest. But Gideon raises some interesting points in that episode. So I guess, go watch the episode if you want a whole discussion on mereological nihilism, people in the audience. But I've got a bunch of questions, Jimmy, in the live chat.
Okay.
There was the only topic that we didn't discuss yet is Eucharistic Miracles. We could do it, but if you don't think there's enough time to do it justice,
just let's do it.
Awesome. Okay. So Eucharistic Miracles. Over the past year, I've done a deep dive on I guess 4 of them. So Lanciano, Buenos Aires, Tixla, and so I can't pronounce the town in Poland. Skokolka.
Yeah, the Polish one.
Yes, the Polish one. And my key takeaway from each one was that none of the work was peer reviewed. The scientists were often hand selected by the Catholic investigation team. And for these reasons, I'm generally skeptical of all of them. My question for you is, what are your personal thoughts on them? But then after I ask the question, I'm just going to add, I love your episodes in Mysterious Worlds on these Eucharistic Miracles. And I in particular love them because I don't think in any of those episodes do you ever give your personal opinion. You have a very kind of like just the facts approach. And you're like, okay, let's approach this through faith. Let's approach this through reason. My job here is done. Like, I'm not going to tell you what to think, which I think that's a super cool approach. But so my question for you is, what do you think?
Okay, well, I do try to give a bottom line, in terms of what I think in each episode, as kind of a form of personal accountability. But my bottom line is often not firmly conclusive, but I do try to offer a summary of here's my opinion based on the evidence we've covered. There's really only one episode where I cover Eucharistic Miracles in depth. And I look at the ones that you mentioned. And for that episode, so the limiting problem I always have is what can I get access to that I can read in a reasonable amount of time? And that basically, I can read short passages in a reasonable amount of time that are in other languages like Latin or something. But if I'm going to read a whole book, it needs to be in English. And I was able to locate a particular book that was written by an Italian physician and had been translated into English about these miracles. And so that was my primary source for that episode. I don't have the ability to track down scientific papers in Italian and read them. And so I can't really form an opinion beyond what I have been exposed to. Now, you said that I guess I have a couple of thoughts interacting with what you said regarding the state of the evidence. One is you said that it's not peer-reviewed. And you may be right, but I don't know that you're right because I haven't seen the journal articles that if there were journal articles to support these because they're all in Italian. And so I don't know whether it's peer-reviewed or not. It may be peer-reviewed. It may not be peer-reviewed. The other thing you said was that the scientists had been hand-selected, and I'm not sure what you mean by that. What I know is that in the case of investigating miracles in connection with saint canonizations, The Vatican does not care what your religious opinion is. What they care about is your scientific credentials. And for an illustration of this, there's a Canadian blood pathologist named Jacqueline Duffin. And a number of years ago, she got asked to examine a case. They wanted to show her before and after slides of someone's blood and and get her scientific opinion. Is there any medical explanation for the difference in these slides? And she looked at the data and she said, well, no, there's no medical evidence, no medical explanation for this. She thought what she was dealing with was some kind of malpractice lawsuit. She thought that it's going to turn out that someone's lab work got switched or something like that, and that's what was at fault here, that there was some doctor, that's what the issue was here, that there was some doctor who had committed malpractice, and that's what she was being asked to comment on. I was like, yep, no, there's no explanation for this, with the implication being some doctor has committed malpractice. Lo and behold, she's startled to discover this is a saint canonization case, and she's being shown the before disease and the after absence of the disease. Well, they never asked her what her religious opinions were. In fact, she's an atheist. They didn't care about that for purposes of investigating is the scientific aspect of the miracle. They just wanted to know, is she qualified to offer a scientific opinion on it? And the answer was yes. So even though she was an atheist, she did this. She was so impressed that she later went over to the Vatican and did research in the so-called secret archive, which is not really secret, on saint canonization. She wrote a whole book about it called Medical Miracles. So I don't know in these particular studies, because they're in Italian and I can't read them, I don't know if the scientists who conducted them were selected in an inappropriate manner. I mean, it may be they happen to be Catholic, but that might happen to be because they were in Italy or in Mexico or in Poland. I don't consider that an automatic sign of bias if they're genuinely credentialed. I'm not going to look at someone's research and say, oh, you're a Catholic, therefore I'm going to dismiss your scientific findings. Now, it could raise a question, just how good is this science? Could it be affected by the religious view of the person? But I can't just dismiss it on the ground that someone is a Catholic or whatever they are. I'd have to know more than that in order to indict their findings if they're genuinely qualified. So those are my comments about appraising the evidence. I have to then work with the evidence I've got, which basically amounted to this book. And based on what I read in the book, I would say that I think there's enough evidence to say that some Eucharistic miracles are probably genuine, but I haven't studied any of the cases in the kind of detail, because I don't have access to the primary sources. I haven't studied any of them in the kind of detail that would let me conclude this one really is for sure supernatural. So yeah. I guess that would kind of be my position.
Yeah. Before we get too far away, this question, what case is this, was specifically regarding the doctor who didn't even realize that she was working on a canonization case, and then went on to go write a book. Could you repeat her name? Yeah,
Jacqueline, and it's J-A-C with a Q, Jacqueline with a Q, if I recall correctly. Duffin, D-U-F-F-I-N. Her book is called Medical Miracles, and there have also been articles published about her story and the canonization in question.
Perfect. Thank you, Jimmy.
I think it's Jacquelyn.
That's a very unique spelling.
It is. Well, that's what struck me about it. It's not the normal spelling.
Yeah, that's why you remember. That's funny. I'll ask you one last question about Eucharistic miracles, maybe, before we go to Q&A.
Sure.
And that is, so I remember from your episode on Lanciano, you do comment about the amount of time between the initial occurrence, which according to the legend would have been in the 700s, I believe, right?
Yep.
But then the first mention of it that we have is from the 14th century or something like that.
It's several centuries later. I don't remember the exact date.
Me neither. Yeah, several centuries though. Do you like would that make you more skeptical of Lanciano versus something like Buenos Aires or Tixla, which like in those cases it's the miracle happens and within the week it's in the hands of
yes. Yeah. Now it doesn't deprive it of all value because at least here we have a physical object that can be examined. And so you can look at it, for example, and say, is this human cardiac tissue or not? Has it been cut in such a way that could have been done in the century it's first reported? And if the answer is yes, it is human cardiac tissue, and no, it couldn't have been cut in this way given the tools they had in the century it's first reported, well, then I think that has some positive evidential value. So it's not like an apparition or a bilocation where there's no report of it for 1,000 years. We are able to study something objective today. But it also raises a question in my mind because even though we have a physical object to examine, we don't have thorough provenance on it. We can't trace it all the way back in the historical record to when it first appeared. We can't examine it in situ, to borrow a phrase from archaeology.
Yeah. Okay, Jimmy, this whole session has been fantastic. We've been going for an hour and 20 minutes, and you've answered every single question I've thrown at you.
Oh.
Are you ready to do some audience Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I've got 15 queued up. And so...
I may need to go through them rather quickly.
That's what I was just going to say.
Okay.
And if it takes you some time to answer some of them, and then we don't get to all of them, so be it. But if you keep 15 in mind and you're able to get through them quickly, fantastic. I'm gonna pull up the first one. So Colin says, and this goes back to when we were talking about ESP and all that. So he says, if all this ESP stuff is true and supernatural forces are causally active, but they're not physical, and so we can't measure them, how do we determine causality if it can't be measured?
Well, we can see the effect. And there's a basic assumption in science that when you see an effect, it's due to a cause. You may not be able to directly detect what the cause is, but you can measure the effect. And so, to give a parallel example from another area of science, we can see that galaxies do not rotate in exactly the way that Newton's laws would predict. And so so something's causing that. And currently there's a debate about what's causing that. One proposal is that it's something called dark matter, which is matter that does not interact electromagnetically, and so we can't detect it using electromagnetic sensors. We can only see its gravitational effect. The other proposal is that Newton's equations are, and as modified by Einstein, are slightly inaccurate, that there needs to be a new slight adjustment factor added in when they're applied on galactic scales. And this is a theory known as modified Newtonian dynamics, or MOND. But either way, whether dark matter is the explanation or MOND is the explanation or a combination of the two of them is the explanation, we can measure the effect. We just aren't certain of what's behind the effect, of what's causing it. And in the same way with parapsychology, we can measure the effect. We can see, does this person have beyond random chance knowledge of the future, or beyond random chance knowledge of what's in the locked box, or things like that. Or in psychokinesis, did the random number generator that we're studying behave anomalously when the person was trying to make it behave anomalously and not other times? We can see the effect. The thing is, we don't have a good explanation of the cause yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Jimmy. The next one it's actually kind of like two in a row. So it's just, I think, out of text. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church says that private revelation is not required to be believed. However, some private revelations are included in the Mass, which is inerrant. Is private revelation really not required to be believed if some private revelation is included in the Mass? And she just added claimed. to be in our
Okay, well, so I think that the resolution is found in studying what is meant in terms of inerrancy in the Mass. This is not a claim the Church makes. There may be individual authors out there who say things like the Mass is inerrant, but the Church never says that. What the Church says is that when the Eucharist is consecrated in the way that the Church prescribes, it genuinely becomes the body of Christ. And when we celebrate the Mass, it gives glory to God and things like that. But that doesn't mean that every single historical claim or thing that could be taken as a historical claim in connection with the Mass is accurate. For example, Christmas coming up. We're coming up on Christmas, December 25th. But the Church does not claim that Jesus was literally for sure born on December 25th. This is just the date we use to mark it. I mean, he was born, and yeah, the Church is pretty confident he was born, but it's not confident he was born on that day. So you can't look at, the Church celebrates December 25th, therefore he must have been born that day. The Church isn't claiming that kind of historical accuracy for the Mass. And in the same way, Joseph Ratzinger, in the document The Message of Fatima, which he released in conjunction with the publication of The Third Secret, he points out that private revelations, even though they're not obligatory, they can have an effect on popular culture among Catholics and popular devotion, and even on the liturgy. But that doesn't mean the Church is signing off that this really happened. But it would be signing off on, here's something we can do that is going to be in some way spiritually beneficial.
Now, it is dogma, though, that Easter really is the day that Jesus rose from the dead, of course, right? We all know that.
Well, he rose on a Sunday shortly after Passover, but how you celebrate that on which calendar is not
right.
A matter of dogma.
It moves every year, so it was a poor joke, but
okay.
So that girl Ray has another question.
Yeah.
So speaking of Fatima, and so for those of you who don't know, there's stuff about Fatima that's part of the Mass, but that girl Ray would like to hear your thoughts about the prophecies at Fatima, which were written after the fact. So I think specifically referring to like the World War II, the start of World War II,
yeah,
the deaths of her cousins.
So according to the three seers, when they were told the secrets, in 1917, they weren't initially authorized to publish them. And so consequently, some of them didn't get written down for some time. And by the time they got written down, some of them had already been fulfilled. Like, World War I ended, but if people didn't repent, a new and worse war would happen in the reign of Pius XI. And that would be World War II. I think what you think about these depends on your estimation of, because it was Sister Lucy who wrote them down. I think it depends on your estimation of her truthfulness and the accuracy of her memory. Because it could be she was truthful but misremembered, or it could be she remembered perfectly and was a liar, or it could be she remembered perfectly and she was being truthful. So I think it depends on your estimation of those, what you make of them. Would I show them to a non-believer as proof that this is a genuine apparition? No, I wouldn't, because they're not documented in the record until after they've been fulfilled. On the other hand, if I conclude on other grounds that this is a genuine apparition, do I then need to take seriously her claim that in 1917 the Virgin Mary told her about World War I ending and World War II beginning? Well, yeah, then I would. If I've already concluded on other grounds that this is credible, then I need to take that, more seriously too.
And I'll just highlight that she says, "Thank you." Here it is.
Oh, awesome.
So thank you for the answers. The next three questions I'm going to put up kind of one after the other because they're all related.
Okay.
And they're from Dave Pullman. So why do you believe in Markan priority? Then with the laughing emoji. followed by in all seriousness, as a Griesbach hypothesis guy, I appreciate Akin's interaction with the Griesbach scholars, including obscure ones like Orchard in his series on the synoptic problem. And then as a follow-up, he says he was wondering if you've read Ward Powers' updated defense of the Griesbach hypothesis, the progression publication of Matthew, and if so, what do you think of it? But I'll go back to the...
Okay, I believe in Markan priority because it's the best explanation for why the synoptics are written the way they are. And I've got, I gather, Faith Because of Reason has seen my series on my website. I have a list of articles linking all the different components I've written thus far, and I talk about this. Basically, Mark is written in an unpolished style, and it includes almost no information that is not in Matthew and Luke, and the information it does include that's not in them is of extremely low value, like, oh, and there was this other one time Jesus healed a guy. And by contrast, the information that it lacks that is in Matthew and Luke is of high value, like the infancy narratives and the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. And so when you combine all those things in terms of the ancient compositional practices, which put a high priority on limiting the size of the manuscript you're writing, because the paper had to be handmade, the ink had to be handmade, the quill had to be handmade, and all of the text on the page had to be handmade. Books were fantastically expensive. A single copy of Matthew would have cost more than the equivalent of $2,200 just for one copy of Matthew. And consequently, there was price pressure to keep books short. Well, that means so on the Griesbach hypothesis, where Mark is written last, and he's basically fusing together Matthew and Luke, why on earth would he just copy stuff that 97% of it is in Matthew, 95% of it's in Matthew, and why would he reject these very high-value passages in exchange for putting in just a handful of very low-value passages? That doesn't make any sense. The much more logical explanation is Mark is first, and Matthew and Luke then supplemented Mark with high-value information and trimmed and polished Mark so that they'd have their own ability to fit their Gospels inside a single scroll. So that's kind of a short course, or a short answer in terms of why I prefer Mark in priority, the idea that Mark was written first. Also, there's a second reason, in addition to it just not making any sense why Mark would do this if he was writing last. Also, I believe that the earliest testimony we have on record is for Mark in priority. The early church writer Papias, who was Bishop of Hierapolis, interviewed various people who were eyewitnesses or one step away from eyewitnesses of Jesus, including an eyewitness he refers to as John the Elder. And he has a quotation from John the Elder, where John the Elder says, Mark wrote his order, but not in, and the word can be translated a couple of different ways, but not in order. He could mean literary order, he could mean chronological order, but it's not a polished work. And he's defending Mark here. He says Mark wrote his gospel not in order because that wasn't his goal. His goal was to remember everything Peter had preached, and that's what he wrote his gospel on. Whereas Matthew wrote a gospel that was in order, whether you mean polished literary order or something else. Okay, he just told us where Mark got his information. It's Peter. Mark was not copying Matthew and Luke. Mark was copying what Peter said. And that, coupled by the fact he says, on the other hand, Matthew then wrote one that was in order, and he says that after he explains how he got Mark, that implies Matthew was written after Mark. So I think the earliest text we have, and John the Elder was an eyewitness of Jesus and is probably one of the other authors of the New Testament. I think we have evidence from another New Testament author testifying to Mark in priority. And even if he's not another author of the New Testament, he's still first century. We've got first century testimony to Mark in priority.
Awesome. Thanks, Jimmy.
He also asked, am I aware of the progressive publication of Matthew? Answer: yes, I am, and I apply Occam's razor to it. It requires us to suppose that Matthew was published in a series of stages, and we have no evidence that that's the case. I would also say we have evidence against it being the case because of precisely how expensive books were to write. You know, if you wanted to launch a gospel, let's say you wanted 10 copies of it so you could send them to different churches. Well, if Matthew costs $2,200, 10 copies to launch your new gospel into the church, that's going to cost $22,000. You're scarcely likely to make multiple stabs at that goal. You're probably going to do it once. And so unless we have really compelling evidence for more than one version of Matthew, I think we need to stick with Occam's razor and say don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Assume there was one version of Matthew until you have evidence for multiple versions.
I don't want to get bogged down here, but I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Is this kind of like multiple stage Matthew something different than, so where my mind went to was like, so for instance, Mark and John, we know that stuff has been added to those. So like the long ending of Mark.
I'll give you that one. I don't give it to you on John.
Oh, you think that the pericope adulterae was part of?
I'm sorry. I was thinking of John 21.
Oh no. So my mind went to the pericope adulterae, and that's just a single pericope. So it's not, massive. But is the, I'm just unfamiliar with what Dave is talking about with the like Matthew in stages or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that similar or is that something different?
It's different. In the case of the longer ending of Mark, for one reason or another, people had a version of Mark in hand that ended at Mark 16:8 on an unsatisfying note. That just requires one person to then write a summary ending and stick it on the end. And actually that happened more than once. But here's the deal. We've got evidence for these different versions. We have some manuscripts of Mark that lack the longer ending, some of them that have the longer ending, some of them that have a shorter ending that's different from the first two. So we have evidence for multiple versions of Mark. In his own lifetime, though, Mark presumably only wrote one version, and then it got added onto by different later authors, whereas the progressive publication of Matthew presupposes a first century author who's releasing multiple editions of his own work.
Okay. Yeah. So it is different. It's not the same as just an additional ending to Mark. It's this hypothesis is that the original author wrote and then wrote again and then wrote it. Okay. I see. Okay. I'm going to put these two together. So Stephanie asks, Jimmy, do you think that if the church declared a miracle worthy to be believed, and then later that miracle was proven like false, is that an argument against the truth of Catholicism?
So let me pose a counter question that I think will be illuminative. Let's suppose a scientist declared that he had made a particular discovery, any field you want, medicine, physics, whatever, and later it turned out that claim was wrong. Would that disprove science?
I mean, certainly not.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. It would prove that instance was wrong, but it wouldn't prove the whole system was wrong, because the whole system does not depend on just saying, yeah, we think this is reasonable to believe.
Cool. And I guess just to interject a little bit here, the church never really declares these things infallibly. Like
no.
If she did, that would be a bigger concern.
Yeah, it would. Then you could have an argument about it disproving Catholicism, but the church never does that. When it comes to extra biblical phenomena like Marian apparitions and miracles, it never says infallibly this is the case. It says this is a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence we've seen thus far.
Cool. Okay.
Which is the same thing that scientists do.
Jimmy, I'm going to put a question up here and I'm going to answer it first, and you can feel free just to say ditto. I don't have comments about Michael Voris or Church Militant. I just don't. I have no comments. Does your answer reflect mine, Jimmy?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details. I mean, I've read, stories about Michael Voris's resignation from Church Militant, and I'll freely confess I've never been a fan of Michael Voris or, Church Militant more broadly. That's not to say they'd never done good work, but I find what they do spiritually unhealthy, in my opinion. It's all built, or frequently it is built around feeling superior to other people on a consistent basis, and I find that unhealthy. Having said that, I don't know the details of what Michael Voris's situation was. I could guess, but that's just guessing. I think that regardless of what it involved, it's his business. And it's the business of the board of Church Militant. It is not the public's business. It's a private matter. But since it's been announced, I think we should pray for Michael Voris and for Church Militant. We should love them as brother Christians, just like we should love everybody and pray for everybody who's in a difficult situation.
Am I allowed to say amen? Amen.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I'm one of those weirdos who I unironically say, like, pray for us. Like, I'll say it, Our Lady of Guadalupe, pray for us. I don't think that was a veridical apparition. I don't care. I say it anyway. This is probably a quick one for Jimmy. Are canonizations infallible?
Well, there's a very common opinion that they are. It seems to be an opinion, though. It doesn't seem to be a matter of church teaching. And there have been theologians who are thoroughly Orthodox theologians who have questioned whether or not they're infallible. An example of that would be Cardinal Avery Dulles. If you read his book Magisterium, he raises this as a question. He points out it's not easy to see how a saint canonization would fit with what the church understands about its infallibility. The church understands that it can infallibly define two classes of things. The first class of things are items that have been passed on to us as matters of faith from Christ and the apostles. In other words, what's known as the deposit of faith. So if Christ taught something, the church can infallibly define, here's what that means. The other thing that it's said it can infallibly define are things that are outside of the deposit of faith, but that are necessary to defend something that is in the deposit of faith. So let's say, with the first example, something's in the deposit of faith, people aren't sure what it means, the church has a council that infallibly defines, here's what that means, and then someone comes along and says, oh yeah, but that wasn't an ecumenical council. That doesn't have authority. Well, the church could come back and say, no. We infallibly defined that was an ecumenical council because that's needed to defend this other thing that is in the deposit of faith. Well, when it comes to canonization of saints, a canonization of a saint says this person's in heaven. That's the basic fact it's asserting. And that is means that the person died in a state of grace. They if they had been in sin, they repented before they died, or if they were in a state of grace, they didn't at the last minute commit some unknown sin that no one could perceive. Well, individuals like Cardinal Dulles and myself would raise the question, how is it necessary to defend something in the deposit of faith to know whether someone died in a state of grace or not? It doesn't look like it is. And if it's not necessary, then the church has not said it can infallibly define that. It said we can infallibly define things that are necessary to defend things that are in the deposit of faith, and this doesn't look necessary.
This is a question that I personally like, but it's a question for you,
okay,
about me. So
okay.
you might have a
Jube.
Yeah, you might have a difficult time answering this one, only because you aren't my confessor. But you could feel free to take a stab at it if you'd like. So hypothetically, Kevin wants to become Catholic again. What does Jimmy say is Kevin's biggest barrier to do so, I guess.
Well, I mean, I encounter this situation a lot. Someone will say, I want to come back to the church, but I'm having difficulty. And I'll say, okay, what's the difficulty? If it's an intellectual difficulty, I'd ask Kevin, so what's intellectually holding you back? And I would then try to offer assistance with that. If it's not intellectual or not exclusively intellectual, there might be an emotional component, and I try to offer help with that. Or there might be a canonical component. Like there's something canonically you need to do to come back, like, get an annulment or just go to confession. For most former Catholics, all you need to do is go to confession. And so I would say if you want to come back and there are no intellectual or other barriers, then go to confession and come back.
And sometimes I annoy people by saying I am still Catholic, because I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you are.
I am, like, by definition. But sometimes I say that, and then Catholics get mad at me for saying that because I'm not practicing, and I'm like, well, okay,
well, you're non-practicing Catholic,
right? And that's what I tried. When I'm good, I say that.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a question; it's just a comment. But I wanted to save it because Anton says Jimmy gets cooler every time I listen to him. I think he could be accurately described as a super intellectual who has also touched copious amounts of grass. And we say that here. I don't know.
Meaning marijuana?
No.
Oh.
No. Touching grass is a saying that means that, like, you are, like, in touch with the real world.
Oh, okay. It's like knowing where your towel is.
Yeah.
Okay.
On my channel, we deal with a lot of the raddest of the trads,
mm-hmm.
and a common critique that we levy is that the really rad trads have never touched grass. Like, they don't know what the real world is like because they live in a little insulated bubble and they never talk to real people.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anton. You're extremely kind. I try to touch grass as much as possible, and for the record, I do not have extensive experience with marijuana.
All right, now that's on the record. Okay, only a couple more, Jimmy. How is original sin just? I didn't eat fruit in any garden, so why am I being punished for my ancestors?
Well, you're not. The church has made it, as the course of time has gone along, the church has explained more clearly what original sin does and does not mean. And one of the things it's been clear about, this is in the Catechism, for example, is that it's not in the nature of a personal fault. You are not being punished for you. Original sin is not something you're personally at fault for, and consequently, you're not being punished in anything but a poetic way. To give you an illustration, let's suppose you got a guy who's rich, and he's also a gambler. And he goes out and gambles. This is a real story. This has happened to people. I mean, this happened, for example, in not Sheldon Van Auken's family, the author of the big 3-volume set history on the Civil War, Shelby Foote. Is that right? Anyway, this situation really happens where you've got money in a family. They're well off, but the family patriarch has a gambling problem, and he goes and he gambles away the family's fortune, and then the children grow up destitute, and they're in extreme poverty because of what their father did. Poetically, you could say the children are being punished because of their father's gambling, but that's poetry. That's not literal. They are not literally being punished by anyone. Their father made a mistake and they got hurt. That's what original sin is. Originally, mankind was in spiritual union with God, but Adam and Eve threw that spiritual union away. They lost sanctifying grace, and therefore they were unable to pass sanctifying grace on to their offspring. And so we are born in a state where we need to re-receive that grace in order to be in spiritual union with God. What original sin is, it's that state of being deprived of sanctifying grace. But that's not a punishment except in anything but a poetic sense. It's just our ancestor did something wrong and we got hurt as a result, but it's not a consciously inflicted punishment from God where he's literally punishing us. So I guess that's a brief answer to what I have to say there. I could say more, but that'll keep it brief.
Sounds good. Daniel said that he also thought that Anton meant weed, and Anton said, I certainly did not mean to imply marijuana. So I'm glad that we've got that cleared up. I've got 3 more questions. Hopefully these don't take too long. I've kept you for 2 hours already. If Eucharistic miracles are meant to boost the faith of those who are doubting, why are the reports that do exist so hard to access and review? Why no genetic tests?
Okay, I think there are several answers here. The first one is I have to comment on the premise of the question, which is that Eucharistic miracles are meant to boost the faith of those who are doubting. That is sometimes what a miracle does, but I don't think that's what it always does. Like in healing miracles, for example, well, they can boost the faith of people who witness a healing miracle, but also they have other effects, like the person gets healed. Maybe the purpose of the healing miracle was the healing. And in the same way, maybe it's not that the person's faith needs to be strengthened by a Eucharistic miracle. Maybe it's just it'll be beneficial for them in some way. It'll make this more real to them. For example, I was recently asked by a priest. He said to me, you've done research on Eucharistic miracles. And I said, well, I've done some. And he said, well, recently I had someone come to me and say that when they put the host in their mouth, it like tripled in size and started to have a texture like meat and a taste like blood. And they went ahead and swallowed it. But then they came to me and said, what do you make of that? And so what he wanted to know from me is, am I aware of parallel cases? And he, of course, told the person that asked him this, well, since it's swallowed, there's no way we can evaluate it. But he wanted to know, am I aware of parallel cases? And I am. I know someone who had an experience very much like that, where they put the host in their mouth, it seemed to become meat. They bit it. They had blood in their mouth, and they went ahead and swallowed. Okay, so who was that meant for? Well, I would say in both of these cases, assuming the experience was real, it was meant for the person who had it. Did it imply the person didn't have faith? No, I don't have any evidence of that. Will it have a spiritual benefit of a compelling, wow, this is really real, I need to take this seriously? Yeah, it'll have that for the person, and you might be able to classify that as boosting their faith, or maybe just having a more vivid awareness of what they already believed. So I guess that's the first part of the issue, is I'm not sure that that's the reason for Eucharistic miracles is to boost people's faith. Even if it is to boost people's faith, it would primarily be the people who are the witnesses of the miracle, not people elsewhere in the world, just like these people were in a situation where the obvious thing to do was swallow. That wasn't meant to be put on display for the world. That was for that person. And in the same way, if a miracle happens in a parish in a way that multiple people witness it, it's principally for those people. It's an added bonus if it can be verified in a way that it becomes convincing for people elsewhere in the world, but that's a bonus. It's not something we should expect. Then we hit the practical issues here, like why no genetic tests? Well, I think for 2 reasons. One, genetic tests are very recent. And some of the studies, like of the Lanciano miracle, that was done like back in the 80s. They didn't have genetic testing then. And that leads to, well, then why hasn't it been done more recently? Well, okay, genetic tests presently are destructive. And you have to destroy matter in order to do a genetic test. Now, fortunately, we're getting to the point where you have to destroy a lot less matter. And I think genetic tests will be possible in the future. So I would expect in the future we will be seeing genetic tests, but they've only been available recently, and they've been destructive. And if something's a miraculous object, you kind of want to be hesitant to destroy it, or even part of it. So I think there are reasons why they haven't been common up to now, but I think they will be more common in the future. Then we come to the part of the question about why are the reports so hard to access and review? 2 reasons. These instances happen in other countries where they don't speak English. That makes it harder to review and access. You can't. It's much harder to Google and pull them up and read them. The other thing is academic publishing is broken. And there are not open access journals, and typically journals are sold to libraries who pay a fortune for them. I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried to buy an academic article, but a single article, they'll want $80 or more for it. And so academic publishing is just broken. We need more open access journals. And because these things are not appearing in open access journals and they're in other languages, it makes it harder to access and review.
Yeah, you preach particularly about open access journals.
Yeah.
If extra ecclesiam nullus salus, outside the church there is no salvation, holds true, why was the religious tradition necessary for salvation transmitted in a way that was not universally accessible or comprehensible? And this question does come from a Catholic too.
Well, I think that extra ecclesiam nullus salus has to be understood in the correct way. It's often understood in a woodenly literal way of you've got to be a card-carrying Catholic in order to get saved. And that has never been the understanding. It has always included exceptions. In the early church, which is when this doctrine was first articulated, you had people discussing baptism of blood for martyrs and baptism of desire for catechumens. And then subsequent to the exploration to the discovery of the New World, it was realized there are millions of people who have never even heard of Jesus. They can't all be going to hell through no fault of their own, and that led to a reappraisal of you needing to be innocent. You need to be at fault for not believing the gospel message. If you're not at fault for not believing it, then it is actually possible for you to be saved. So once we arrive at a correct understanding of extra ecclesiam nullus salus, where you understand if you are fully culpable for your rejection of the faith, then you won't be saved. It applies to a much smaller number of people than you would otherwise guess. And consequently, this is not exactly the best way to put it. I'd have to think of how the best way to put it is. But the urgency of articulating the gospel message in the clearest, most compelling way that's going to win everybody as fast as possible, because there are no exceptions, doesn't apply, because there are more exceptions, and God will only hold you accountable for what you are responsible for knowing. And a lot of people are not responsible for their rejection of the faith. And therefore, God is still willing to work with those people. And if they otherwise respond to the degree of grace that they've received, then they can be saved. So so that's a general sketch of the answer. I'm sure I could put it more concisely and precisely if I thought about it more, but that's an off the top of my head answer.
A pretty good one for off the top of your head, if I may say so. Last question. Does Jimmy believe that all the Pauline epistles were written by Paul the Apostle? Mm-hmm. Many scholars think that 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then I'll add to Titus as well, are pseudographic.
Yeah, no, I think they're all by Paul. And I don't find the arguments for them being written by someone else in the Pauline circle compelling. I frankly think they're weak arguments, and the balance of evidence points to them being written by Paul. I could go into why, but that would involve a lengthier answer. Oh, I do have a book though. Well, I don't know how much I deal with the Deutero-Pauline issue in it. I do have a book though called The Bible is a Catholic Book, where I talk about what I believe the plausible reconstructed history is of the books of the Bible, including the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus.
Very cool. Anton says thank you.
Thank you, Anton.
I say thank you as well. Before we officially wrap up, I would like to say that I have just put a link in the live stream, in the live chat. Mm-hmm. I'll put it in the description of this video as well. The link is to StarQuest Media's donation page.
Oh, thank you.
Well, so Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is coming up almost. You're 280 something episodes now. So
yeah, and we're recording episodes. We're recording episodes in the 290s this Saturday.
Okay, so you're closing in on 300, but this is the season of giving. So if anybody appreciates Jimmy's work as much as I do, you can find the StarQuest Media donate page at the link that I just put in the description.
And it's pretty easy to say as well. It's just sqpn.com/give.
Perfect. Thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you.
So now that I've put that in the live chat, I just want to say, Jimmy, thank you so much. This was incredible, especially for a channel of my size. It really means the world to me that you spent not just some time, but you spent 2 hours being grilled by my questions and the questions of all of my subscribers. So it really does mean the world to me.
Happy to do it. And if you want to do it again sometime, that's fine. And per what I mentioned to you, I'll also be putting this on my channel to let more people know about your channel.
Yes. And if you've watched it today, you must rewatch it on Jimmy's channel as well, so that Jimmy gets the views and the duration and stuff. So that's my official rule. Okay, everybody. So you got to listen to me. My final question for you, Jimmy, is where can we everybody I always say, where can we find you? Everybody knows where to find you, but what are you working on next that you're excited about?
Oh boy. Well, I'll also recap where to find me. So I work for Catholic Answers. Our website is Catholic.com. My personal website is JimmyAkin.com, which I use as kind of a hub for almost all of my activity. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/JimmyAkin. My Mysterious World podcast can be accessed at mysterious.fm. And in terms of what I'm working on, well, I'm right now I'm writing scripts for Mysterious World. I plan to do a good bit of script writing in December. Some of the episodes that I have coming up, some of these are already in the can, but they're still coming up. This week, this Friday, I have an episode of Mysterious World coming up on synesthesia, which is a scientific mystery. It involves cross-connecting different categories, typically sensory categories, like seeing shapes and colors in your head when you hear music, or associating letters and numbers with colors. And I happen to be a synesthete. In fact, I'm a multiple synesthete. I have multiple forms of synesthesia. And I'll not only be talking about the mystery, but I'll be showing you examples of, like, this is what I see when I hear music. And this is what I experience when I see words written. Or and also some forms of synesthetic-like experiences that I haven't even seen classified and I've never talked about in public before. So that's this Friday. Then I have the next one is going to be the Tomb of Christ. What evidence do we have for which tomb of Christ, if any, is accurate? And there is one that we have good evidence is accurate. Coming up in January, we're going to have our very first episode is going to be on disturbing near-death experiences. You often hear about people having near-death experiences. They see the tunnel, they see the light, they're greeted by relatives, they look down and see their body, all that stuff. And the way you often hear it reported, it's also blissful. It's just great, wonderful. What about hell? Do we ever get reports of that? Yeah, we do. And they've been understudied for 2 reasons. One, because the near-death experience researchers didn't want to find them. And 2, because the people who've had those experiences, they don't want to talk about them. But recent research, they have begun to be studied now. Recent research indicates that between 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 near-death experiences contain disturbing elements. So that's like maybe 1 in 5 or more, because these are probably undercounted. So we're going to be talking about those and what they do and don't mean. Then we have an episode on the Holy Fire, an Orthodox miracle reported in Jerusalem every Easter. We have an episode coming up on the Tylenol murders from 1982, and a bunch more fascinating stuff coming up. I've just got to get it all written.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I find the writing to be significantly more work than the actual just sitting down and recording.
It makes the recording so much better, though.
Oh, it does. Yeah, when I was first starting, I was trying to do things like a little bit more off the cuff, and none of it came out good. So I gave up, and I said, nope, I need to write everything down. So,
yeah.
Jimmy, thank you so much. had to change the location of the stream last minute, so links are not in the description of this stream, but I'm going to be adding links to all of Jimmy's websites to the description of this video as soon as we're done, so that you can go find him. And Jimmy, thanks again. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, and thanks to everybody in the audience.
All right. Well, yes, and thank you, audience, for fantastic audience participation tonight. I've been Kevin. This has been Jimmy Akin, and until next time.